And good morning to all. And on behalf of IFC and the team, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. I just wanted to add that this is the first of a series of webinars around the IFC Sustainability Framework. And this one is really a high-level overview of the Sustainability Framework and the performance standards. After this one, there are going to be more in-depth webinars on specific performance standards. So maybe just very quickly about IFC. And IFC is the largest global development institution focused on the private sector in developing countries. We are a member of the World Bank Group, and our mandate is to advance economic development and improve the life of communities where our projects operate by enabling the growth of the private sector in developing countries. We achieve this by investing in all sectors and also through financial intermediaries. And in our last fiscal year, we committed 22 billion in long-term finance. So part of our mandate is also our environmental and sustainability policies and how we operate on these different markets. So IFC approach, ESG approach, has evolved over the past 25 years. We began, given that we are part of the World Bank Group, we began using the World Bank safeguard policies. However, these were adapted really to the public sector. And around 2000, under the leadership of Rachel Kite, we decided that we also needed something more adapted to the type of projects that we did and to the private sector, something that spoke very much about how the private sector was going to implement environmental and social standards. So in 2006, we introduced, and at that time it was a revolution, really, we introduced the IFC Sustainability Framework and the performance standards, which was really a breakthrough at the time. And these have been, over the past 15 years, they have been globally recognized as a benchmark for environmental and social risk management in the private sector. These have been adopted also by different other development financial institutions and also by the Equator Principles by over I think 90 banks in different countries, covering a large percentage of project finance. So we have been evolving, and during this 15 years, we also learned a lot on the implementation, the challenges of implementation of our performance standards, and we have been developing several good practice notes and guidance notes for clients and also for our specialists to better assess and to better implement mitigation measures on the ground. Several of those are in our website, and two of the ones that are coming up very soon is one on reprisals, which we are jointly publishing with IDB Invest, and then also IFC Contextual Risk Framework and tool, which we have been already implementing, and we are in the final phase of piloting in some of our projects. So maybe very quickly, the sustainability framework, the architecture. We wanted to, when we were developing the framework, the architecture, we wanted to very clearly define what were the responsibilities of IFC as an institution and what were the responsibilities of the client. So that's why we divided the policies into the sustainability policy and the access to information policy, which is really IFC responsibility towards sustainability and IFC responsibility on publication and sharing of information. So these are things that apply to us and that IFC has committed to implement. Then we have the 8 performance standards on sustainability, on environmental and social sustainability, which is really what are the client's responsibility when IFC invests in the projects. So these are really focused on clients, and they are also outcome oriented. In terms of implementation tools, the environmental and social review procedure is IFC internal procedure and it describes the roles and responsibilities of the environmental and social specialists throughout the project cycle. So when we are accepting the projects and also during supervision. We also have several implementation tools that have been designed mainly for helping clients to implement the performance standards. And these include the guidance notes. This include also the environmental and health and safety guidelines and several good practice materials that range from environmental to also social aspects. Maybe very quickly on the access to information policy. It defines, as I mentioned before, it defines what IFC makes available to the public. So, for example, institutional information, project level information. This includes the environmental and social review summary and the environmental and social action plans, which are disclosed 30 days before the projects go to board in case of category B projects, or 60 days in case of category A projects. Then we have also development impact information, which is also updated on our disclosure website. We have the IFC disclosure portal, where you can find all the different projects that are disclosed with the relevant information on environmental and social impacts and also mitigation measures.
Thanks, Larissa, and great to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about the sustainability policy, which really outlines IFC's commitment towards development and fighting poverty, as Larissa has mentioned. Together with that, of course, doing no harm to people and the environment. The sustainability policy also emphasizes, cross-cutting issues that we're prioritizing, including carbon growth, gender, ecosystem services, and also corporate governance. The document also outlines IFC's roles and responsibilities in terms of supporting projects which align with the performance standards. Just to be clear, it's probably a question that might come up. A project doesn't need to be fully compliant or 100% compliant with the performance standards for IFC to finance this project. It really is a process of becoming aligned with the performance standards, and we can talk into more details around what that process is, but there's an action plan that would need to be developed to attain that compliance with the performance standards. The document also talks about the ENS due diligence, environmental social due diligence, that IFC undertakes, which of course is commensurate with the risks of the project. We focus both on direct investments, but also on financial institutions. The document further describes the categorization for each project. You're probably quite familiar with this, but we have different categories, both for direct investments and also for financial institutions, based on the risks, sectorial, contextual, project risks. And also the document talks about our supervision role in terms of ongoing monitoring of the projects throughout the life of our investment, to make sure that the ESG, environmental, social, and governance aspects of projects are being managed adequately. This, of course, takes the form of visits from IFC staff and consultants, takes the form of reviews of KPIs, annual monitoring reports, etc. Finally, the document does outline and recognize the importance of the accountability mechanism, and you're probably familiar with the CAO, that basically explains a bit of the role of the CAO and the importance of the CAO in addressing any concerns from stakeholders on IFC finance projects. I'll talk a little bit about the environmental health and safety guidelines. These are very important in terms of managing the EHS, environmental and health and safety aspects of projects. There are a number of guidelines. There's both general guidelines and there's also sectorial guidelines. And all of this is in our website in many languages. But basically, projects which IFC finance need to be compliant or become compliant with the various qualitative and quantitative standards which are outlined in these both general and sectorial guidelines. They range in aspects around pollution prevention and also environmental aspects in general, of course, very sectorial specific as well as occupational health and safety aspects. But this is a very important document. When we say the project meets the performance standards, this also means that the project needs to be meeting the environmental and health and safety guidelines, both the general and as applicable, the sectorial guidelines for that particular sector. Larissa talked a little bit about the performance standards, and again, this is just a very high-level overview. There are going to be webinars which are going to be deep diving into the specifics of each of the performance standards. We wanted to give you a very high-level kind of description of these and address any kind of high-level comments that you have or questions. And we're going to go very broadly through each of them. I'm not going to go through each of them right now, but you can see them on the screen. They range on a myriad of environmental and social aspects, you know, from environmental risk management, labor, resource efficiency and pollution prevention, community health and safety, land resettlement, land acquisition, biodiversity management, indigenous peoples, and also cultural heritage. Again, we're going to go kind of broadly through each of them, and hopefully we can answer some high-level questions on each one. Before we move into the performance standards, we wanted to show this slide, which is really at the base of all the performance standards, and it's this notion of the mitigation hierarchy. As you read the performance standards and the guidance notes which accompany the performance standards, you will see this phrase and this approach being referenced very often. From our experience, and as good international practice outlines, it is much better to anticipate and avoid an impact than to be able to mitigate or compensate it. In that line, you know, starting early in the planning when possible and in the design of a project to be able to de-risk and you know, take out the actual risk before it actually occurs, in our experience, it is really conducive to making the project sustainable, reducing costs, and actually making sure that the project is moving in the right direction. We have seen many experiences where this hasn't happened, and where trying to retrofit and try to address the impact when it has occurred can have, again, a lot of cost implications and delays and challenges, technical challenges as well. So in as much as possible, anticipating an impact is the way to go. And, you know, if that cannot happen, then you minimize the impacts and the risks. And if that can't happen, you compensate or offset. A key aspect of this, of course, is the alternatives analysis, as many of you are aware of, in terms of the impact assessment, where in the alternatives analysis, you're looking at the most significant risks and trying to de-risk the project on those significant risks to avoid that impact altogether and not go through the various other phases of the mitigation hierarchy. So performance standard number 1, which is really the assessment and management of environmental and social risks and impacts. The importance of this is really to carry out an integrated assessment of all environmental and social impacts and opportunities for the project. Throughout this process, an effective engagement with stakeholders, communities, local communities, and other stakeholders, and integrating this information and this feedback into the project itself, and the ongoing management of the ENS performance of the project through the management system. PS1 applies to all our projects. Based on the nature and the scope and the context of a project, different performance standards will apply. But this first performance standards, which we kind of call the umbrella performance standards, applies to all projects because that's where you're doing your risk identification process. As part of this risk identification process in PS1, other performance standards can be triggered in different, depending again on the context and on the particulars of the project. But PS1 applies to all projects. In terms of the objectives, it's really to do a good environmental and social impact assessment or risk assessment. As I mentioned earlier, it's incorporating the notion of a mitigation hierarchy into the project design and management. It's improving an ongoing improvement of the performance of the project on ENS, environmental and social grounds, through the management system. The management system component here is extremely important. It's really at the, this concept of plan, do, check, act, and this continuous improvement process is key to be able to be proactive and identify and manage the risks and impacts of projects. So we have a strong focus on the management system. Of course, can measure it with the risks of the project and the impacts of the project. And another big part of PS1 is that of stakeholder engagement and building good relationships with communities, having a good stakeholder engagement plan, developing a good grievance mechanism procedure, which can be readily implemented as effective at the ground level. A little bit about the management system. Again, many of you are probably familiar with ISO 14001 and good international practices on management systems. But PS1 outlines each of these steps here, as you're seeing on the slide, around what are the components of a management system that we're looking at. Of course, as I mentioned, the robustness or the magnitude of the management system will be commensurate with the risks of the project. For a large project, the management system will be quite extensive and quite comprehensive. For a smaller project, the management system will be much simpler. However, this continuous improvement process needs to be there of plan, do, check, act. Again, I'm not going to go through each one of them. They're already in the performance standard, but of course it starts with a policy. It goes into, identifying the risks adequately, putting in place management plans to address these risks, having the right people in place to be able to address the ENS risks and impacts of a project, discusses emergency preparedness and response. We talked about stakeholder engagement, and then of course the closing loop around monitoring and review. And this continuous improvement process is important in any management system. Larissa?
Thank you, Raimi. So PS2 on labor and working conditions. I think for all of us, it seems very logical that workers are an invaluable asset for any company, and that a healthy relationship between workers and management will help a company to grow. However, we see several cases where it's even very challenging to identify who is a worker to the company, who holds the contract of that worker, who has the responsibility to enforce any terms of employment on those workers. So although it looks very, very intuitive, and of course everyone would say, of course, a worker is a valuable asset for a company, there are several challenges that are faced when we are assessing projects. So here it's really to focus, PS2 really focus on the positives, how a good worker management relationship and good human resources management system and procedures can help the company to have a stable workforce, and also benefit from a motivated workforce that can help the company to grow. We have cases where by not doing so, it has jeopardized the company, and also it has created significant reputational risk to companies, and we have seen several examples of those cases. On the objectives of the labor and working conditions, they are based on the core ILO standards, and It is really to promote the fair treatment and equal opportunity of workers, provide workers also with a safe and health working environment and working conditions. So everything related to occupational health and safety, which in certain industry sectors has also shown to be more challenging than in others. It's also to protect workers that are more vulnerable, like in the cases of, for example, industries where you have migrant workers, and migrant workers that could be internal migrant workers coming from different regions and countries, or migrant workers coming from different countries to work to our third country. And this happens not only in the manufacturing sector, but you have seen it also in other sectors, like, for example, construction. And of course, we have like a zero tolerance, which is child labor and the use of forced labor in any of our projects. So I will stop there, and I think, Tigis, we have just 5 minutes for to answer any questions that came through the chat.
Yes, Larissa. Give us 1 second and we'll send your questions. Okay. So there's a question here. The latest PSs and EHS guidelines are issued quite long time ago. Are there any plan for update or revision?
So maybe I would take that. So yes, they're already a teenager. So the last time we updated them was in 2012. So it is already 8 years. So we are exploring the possibility of updating, but we haven't decided yet, let's say, in timeline. There are, I would say that the practice has evolved, and I think the good practice notes that we have published show also that evolution, and how we are now implementing the performance standards. You have to, I think we shouldn't forget that the performance standards are outcome oriented. So they are focused on an outcome, and I think the implementation and how to reach and meet and get to that outcome has improved over the years. I don't know, Jaime, if you want to add.
Yeah, no, just to complement, to add, Larissa, on the EHS guidelines, that is something that is ongoing, a plan to update the EHS guidelines, not all together, but based on priorities and sectors, etc. There's a plan to update these. So in reality, the EHS guidelines are kind of on an ongoing basis. They are being updated based on further development. So while as Larissa mentioned, there's a discussion and exploring on updating the PSs at this point, the EHS guidelines are being updated, based on an internal program based on the sector.
Okay, there's another question. Which kind of relation, if there exists any, is there between IFC standards and ISO standards?
Well, maybe Larissa, I can start, and maybe you can jump in. I think as you will see throughout the performance standards, we reference several good international practices. If we're talking of mining, for example, I work a lot in mining. We reference the cyanide code and other, good efforts and initiatives in each of these spaces. Same as with the management system. I think ISO over the years has proven to be an effective way of managing the risks and impacts of projects on both, environmental, health and safety, and social. So our performance standards reference, just to clarify, we do not require the project to be certified with ISO 14001 or ROSHAs. What we ask is that it be aligned. So if there's a certification, great, but it's not a requirement for our investment. What we need to make sure is that this continuous improvement process and this cycle of plan, do, check, act is involved in development of a management system. And as I mentioned, depending on the size or the risks, the system will be more or less robust.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about IFC's auditing system for compliance with standards in projects?
Should I take that, Elisa? You want to take it?
Yeah, you take it, and I can maybe chip in on the high risk projects.
Yes. So can you repeat that, Tigist, again on?
Sure. Can you talk a little bit about IFC's auditing system for compliance with standards in projects?
Yeah, so let's see, very broadly, before we get invested in a project, we do a due diligence, an environmental and social due diligence. And the objectives of this due diligence are to assess how the project is managing its risks in line with both local legislation, but also with the performance standards and EHS guidelines. So as part of this due diligence, we identify where this alignment is and where the gaps are. And as part of this process, we developed an environmental and social action plan, ESAP acronym, and which becomes part of our legal agreements with the client. To be able to achieve or attain alignment with the performance standards in time. Again, as part of this, IFC, and part of the value add of IFC is to provide ongoing support and guidance on the performance standards, on the EHS guidelines, to be able to, in time, achieve this alignment. So, and we supervise once the project moves from, say, pipeline to portfolio. Once it's in supervision, we are doing supervision of these projects on an ongoing basis by visits, by engagement with the client, by reporting to make sure that there is this alignment or the ESAP, the Environmental Social Action Plan, is being achieved. So that's in a very broad scale how we kind of assess and integrate compliance of the performance standards in our projects. And the commitment of the client throughout our investment is that they need to become and continue being aligned with the performance standards and compliant with the performance standards.
Maybe if I can add that for high-risk projects, what we call high-risk projects, we have an additional oversight, so additional review of the project, and this covers the ENS due diligence process and also during supervision. So it is an additional, let's say, pair of eyes that looks at how the project is doing against the commitments that the client has done as part of our investment, and as Raimi mentioned, also on how they are implementing the environmental and social action plan.
Great. We have more questions, but we have to move forward to cover the rest of the materials. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Tigist. Let me move on to performance standard number 3 very quickly: resource efficiency and pollution prevention. And again, as the title talks about, this is really around conserving resources and looking at addressing pollution-related matters. Basically, what performance standard number 3 does is it outlines good international practices around these two broad areas, again with a strong emphasis on the mitigation hierarchy, as we mentioned before, and it's really specific to the sector and the project that is meeting these EHS guidelines or these performance standards. In terms of resource efficiency aspects, we look at is, for example, greenhouse gases and reporting and management of greenhouse gases. Energy and water consumption, as again many of you know, this has become a big aspect, especially water, around conserving water, managing water efficiently, carrying out water audits to make sure that there is good management of this resource. In terms of pollution prevention, we discuss waste, we discuss hazardous materials, we discuss pesticide use. And a key aspect here is that PS3, Performance Standard number 3, should be read or implemented in line with the EHS guidelines that we discussed earlier. There's a lot of environmental matters around pollution prevention and environmental management in these EHS guidelines, which are very sector specific. And we need to be, as part of meeting PS3, we should be meeting the EHS guideline requirements outlined in each of the both general and also the sectorial documents. Just going to go very quickly. We talked already about this, but it's really, again, to address project-related pollution, look at conserving resources, including energy and water, and also GHGs. PS4 is a bit of a mix of an environmental and social standard. It basically comes of the realization, under the realization that project activities, infrastructure, equipment can or may expose local communities, the stakeholders and local communities in the surroundings of the project to increase risks around security, around health and safety. In this case, in this instance, Performance Standard number 4 discusses specific topics around emergency response, community risks to disease, security forces, management of security arrangements, hazardous materials, and safety measures that need to be addressed during projects. Again, a lot of this comes during the design of the project. And should be looked at when we're looking at the footprint, looking at the transportation routes, looking at the various infrastructure aspects of a project, which could have an impact on communities downstream or in the area of influence of the project. The objective, again, is to anticipate and avoid, again, talking about the mitigation hierarchy here, and to safeguard personnel and property in accordance with human rights principles. So there's a lot of detail in the PSs in PS4 and also in the guidance notes around kind of the requirements. We reference ILO, we reference the voluntary principles for human rights. And also we talk specifically about, infrastructure, which could be, again, pose a risk to communities. An example is tailings dams, for example, again, going back to the area I focus on. There's quite a bit of discussion around tailings dams, which again are related to the EHS guidelines, which also have aspects around tailings dam designs, etc. Transportation is a big one here, which many of our projects do apply, because to bring materials to sites or to transport local workers, there is a need to use routes which have an interaction with communities and towns. So putting together transportation management plans, doing adequate transportation risk assessments, etc., as part of this standard.
Thank you, Raimi. So PS5 deals with land acquisition and involuntary resettlement. And this is really one of the most complex PSs in terms of not only the assessment part, but also the implementation, and also one that really affects people's lives, because if land acquisition will impact people directly through physical resettlement or livelihoods of communities or individuals, it really affects their lives forever. So that is why it is very important that the assessment part is extremely well done by experts, and also finding mitigation measures is sometimes extremely difficult. We find a lot of the challenges, especially on linear projects, so be it T-lines or roads, where you might be, it is a balance between something that will help the development of the country, but also might affect livelihoods of entire communities, and also maybe of individual households. So the problem also, the performance standards are there also to protect people that cannot say no because they don't have the right to refuse the land acquisition process and will be displaced. And this can be, as I mentioned before, physical displacement or economic displacement. This also has economic impacts to people because the impact on the livelihoods. The objective really of this performance standards is, as much as possible, try to avoid any direct adverse impact, social or economic, on people and communities. But if that avoidance cannot happen by, for example, rerouting maybe the T line or rerouting a road, or finding another plot of land for any business development. If that cannot be avoided, then we have to minimize. So we follow the mitigation hierarchy, which Jaime presented at the beginning of the presentation. One point that I want to highlight is the alternative project analysis. That is extremely important as part of the assessment. Is there any alternative to the project that can follow the mitigation hierarchy of avoidance and minimizing? So in several of the projects, this is something that we work very closely with clients, because sometimes those alternative analyses have not been done in a robust manner. So these are things that, for example, we highlight very much to clients. We also have something that it's avoiding forced evictions. We have some no issues, but I think challenges when, for example, resettlement has happened or has been done by government entities. So sometimes our clients received a plot of land that has been already, let's say, has already been acquired by a government entity and has been, let's say, given to a client for a specific development. So then there the client has very limited leverage to meet the objectives of the performance standards, but we need to work with the client and also with the government entity to achieve those. So the other part, which is extremely important, is if involuntary resettlement cannot be avoided, then how can we improve and restore livelihoods and the standards of living? One important point is also that we have audits, we have completion audits after. Depending on the resettlement action plan and livelihood restoration plans, but it could vary between 5 and 7 years after the resettlement have happened, to ensure that livelihoods and standards of living have been restored or improved.
Thank you, Larissa. We'll talk a little bit about PS6, Performance Standard number 6. As you can recognize, a lot of projects, a lot of developments are located in areas which can have quite a bit of biodiversity sensitivity. In that light, Performance Standard number 6 was developed to apply good international industry practices to the management of these biodiversity resources in a way which, again, follows the mitigation hierarchy, but also achieves, based on the type of habitat that we're talking about, different types of requirements. The Performance Standard 6 is quite technically complex and should be read in line with the guidance note. And of course, during the deep dive in subsequent webinars or sessions, you will be able to go into details. Now it's really more of an overview, but I guess key aspects of this performance standards are the need to early on and based on adequate data and assessments by experts on the particular species or habitats of concern to identify what type of habitat we're talking about for the project. Why is this important? Because based on the type of habitat, the requirements in PS6 are going to be very different. In PS6, we talk about modified habitat, we talk about natural habitat, and we talk about critical habitat. In this light, a critical habitat is the habitat with most sensitivity, and there are numeric thresholds within guidance note number 6 in order to assess and identify whether a project is located in critical habitat. There are various requirements for, as I mentioned, modified, natural, and critical. You've probably heard of the concepts of no net loss of biodiversity, which is applied to natural habitat, and net positive gain, which is applied to critical habitat. I guess a key concept here is critical habitat can be located in both modified and natural habitat. The standard, again, has several requirements around, and quite stringent requirements around critical habitat, especially, but also natural habitat, and also other requirements around modified habitat, and then talks about how to address projects, which could be impacting or could be around legally protected areas or internationally recognized areas. Important when assessing PS6 to not only look at the local registry of protected areas, but also look at the international registry. And there's a lot of websites out there which provides this information. BirdLife International is one. Key biodiversity areas, important bird areas, all these internationally recognized areas could potentially qualify a project for critical habitat and natural habitat. So important to address these as part of the initial assessment of this classification. The performance standard number 6 also talks about ecosystem services and the promotion of sustainable management of natural resources. We also talk a bit about the supply chain aspects of PS6 and integration of conservation needs into and development priorities. So again, quite an extensive standard. Important to have qualified experts in biodiversity, in the species of concern, to assess this critical habitat potential and be able to qualify this habitat, and then put in place, the mechanisms to try to avoid, if possible, and again, back to the mitigation hierarchy, and mitigate with, a last resort being offsets. Again, we can talk much more extensively on all these and the pros and cons of all of these in a session which has a deep dive on PS6.
Thank you, Raimi. So this one, PS7, is also one of the performance standards that needs in-depth expertise, and it is also one of the performance standards which is not triggered very often in our projects. And I think the first step is really to determine if a population that has a distinct, let's say, characteristic from the mainstream groups in let's say in the region or in the country can be really considered as an IP community. And the performance standards mentions some of these characteristics that need to be met for a community to be really designated as indigenous peoples. We also collaborate a lot with the World Bank Group to ensure that we are aligned when we determine that a certain part of the population is considered as indigenous people. So as I mentioned, it needs expertise, and it needs also expertise during the assessment phase. So the objectives in several of the projects where we have indigenous peoples, in most of the cases, these communities are vulnerable communities. So they need, let's say, special attention by project developers, and in this case, our clients, to ensure that we fully respect their rights. As mentioned before, also they are covered by international conventions like the ILO 169 convention. So there are already certain mechanisms that protect their livelihoods, their culture, and also their heritage. So in projects where indigenous peoples have been identified and characterized as such, we also try to do the same. First, avoid. Why is avoidance so important? Because in most of the cases, these indigenous peoples are really very attached to their land and their customs. So it's very difficult to just move them from, let's say, the area where they have been living for ages and just moving somewhere else. The adaptability might be less than with other type of communities. So avoidance is always the best option, but if not, then minimizing any negative impact needs to be included, and this is has to be done in a very cultural sensitive manner to ensure that let's say expected benefits of the project can also be felt by IPs. I think one of the important points is the last bullet point, which is free, prior, and informed consent. But this is done in certain circumstances, which are detailed also in the performance standards. And this is done also by somebody that has the expertise and expertise by regional expertise, because some of the sensitivities, cultural sensitivities vary depending on the regions. So as mentioned before, this is also one of the performance standards, which although it's not triggered very often, it needs a specific expertise to be able to assess and design the appropriate mitigation measures. Cultural heritage, well, it encompasses as it is important because it is part of communities, and it ranges different. It has a range of different characteristics. So it has cultural, historical, and also we find in several projects it has religious significance, and it can vary between. Depending on the type of communities, it can vary between, for example, it could be something like an area, a specific area, a mountain that has very religious connotations for some of the communities, to something very simple, but that is very much related to the culture of the communities that provide that importance to the cultural heritage. So the objective is also the protection and preservation of cultural heritage, and in cases where the project is benefiting from some type of cultural heritage, then that there is an equitable sharing of the benefits with the communities that have assigned that value to that cultural heritage. So the performance standards also goes into details of what those requirements are. PS8 is also one of the performance standards which is not triggered very often. I don't have the numbers on top of my head, but it is, if I remember correctly, less than 10% of our projects that trigger PS8. So some of the points that we wanted also to highlight are emerging issues, ENS issues that have emerged. I think one of the questions was the performance standards are already old, and there have been things that have been coming up in the last 5 years, or even less so, and how we have been adapting to that. Some of those are now in the slide. I think the one that comes to mind is gender-based violence. There are several projects where unfortunately, this has been not only a risk, but really an impact. And clients had to also become more aware on how to assess that and how to deal with the issues. So we have also guidance notes on good practice notes, sorry, on gender-based violence. Another topic is, for example, modern slavery. We also have a good practice note which was done with CDC and other development banks, I think in 2018. It covered child labor and forced labor and also trafficking. So it has some guidance to clients on how they can address, first, how they can assess and how they can address this issue. Then diversity and inclusion, it is, although it is raised under PS2 in labor and working conditions, I think there has been a push on how really this requirement can be implemented more, let's say, more practically, because although it has been there, it has been always difficult to assess and also difficult to implement. Then there is an increased risk on supply chain. I think the risk has been always there. I think now we have better tools that are helping us on identifying those risks and also on mitigating the risks. So if we're talking about, for example, the agro-commodities, then there are, for example, satellite imagery, which is helping us a lot on the risk of deforestation in certain agro-commodities. So I think the tools that are now available are helping us better to support clients in identifying the risk and also on mitigating those. Jaime, I don't know if you want to talk about climate change.
Yes, thanks, Larissa. And just a little bit of compliment on JBV, gender-based violence and inclusion, diversity and inclusion. We have increased our efforts to address this issue, both from a contextual risk screening perspective. We do a lot more screenings early on of projects to address potential challenges on JBV, but also work with our in-house specialists, both on JBV, but also on gender opportunities, and trying to integrate these aspects early into the project design so that there's much more equality in terms of employment, in terms of supply chains, in terms of suppliers, in terms of people involved with our projects, and again, trying to attain that improved balance of gender. On greenhouse gases and climate change, as all of you, of course, know, it's a worldwide issue, governmental issue. A lot more emphasis is being put on climate change. We on IFC, at IFC side, we are also tackling this through working groups in terms of developing additional tools, which will help us understand also what the impacts of climate change will be on the projects, and put in place mitigants, say engineering mitigants, are also which have to or are linked to financial aspects of projects, and incorporating climate change into the financials or any financial implications of projects. So again, we do the impacts of the project on climate change at the ESIA impact assessment aspect of things, but also looking at how climate change can impact the project, and making sure that engineering controls are there for increased rainfall or droughts, etc. Water is a big one, of course, and including this into the financials. Yep. Thank you very much. I think we have a little bit of time for Q&A, Tigist.
Yes, we have about 4 more minutes, but let's see. In addition to assessing risks, how are the PSs used to assess potential opportunities for positive E&S impacts?
Yes, we are assessing risks. I think throughout our investment and early on, we're also identifying opportunities. We just talked about gender, for example. And we have incorporated, for example, into our own decision making at the senior level aspects, developmental opportunities and aspects related to gender, and what we call a gender flag. For example, project can can be called, can be gender flagged. So if it's really going to provide emphasis and focus on this gender equality or inequality and also JPP aspects. So, you know, that's one example of how we're integrating these opportunities. I think, again, climate change and looking at opportunities of mitigating some of the potential risks. If we look at, you know, the modeling of climate change many years in advance and looking how we can potentially improve conditions of local communities. In addition to that, we're also looking at opportunities that go beyond compliance. We have different groups within the IFC, including a group called Advisory Services, which looks at aspects of benefit sharing, looks at aspects of community investment, looks at aspects of capacity building at the government level, etc. So we are always, both we're looking at the compliance side of things, but we're also, you know, in parallel looking at opportunities where IFC or the IFC and the World Bank can leverage their mandates to improve conditions on the ground level. I know it's kind of a general statement, but there's a lot to talk about on this topic as well.
Great. There's another one on if land acquisition is already complete, but we identify a gap, for example, was an undertaken in a willing buyer, willing seller basis, what actions can be undertaken?
So if a gap is identified, if I understood correctly, Tigis, if a gap is identified, even if the client has not been the one doing the resettlement, is that correct?
Yeah, if the land acquisition is already complete, but we identify a gap.
Okay, correct.
Yeah, what actions can be taken on?
So the action is really to, because I think here it comes what is linked to the question that was before. There is still a risk. So the company will be living in that community. So if there is still conflict, if there is still a gap that communities feel that has not been completed and has been identified, there's going to be always a risk to their operations. So one of the alternatives is that we will ask the client to fill in that gap if possible. So for example, if there is any alternative on livelihood restoration, no? If there is a gap, for example, with how much compensation has been provided by the government or the government agency, then it's a discussion with the government agency on how that gap can be filled. There are certain restrictions in countries where government doesn't want clients to just double up that financial gap, and then it's a matter on how to find an alternative to fill in that gap. But there are cases where yes, the government might say, okay, if you want to topple it in terms of compensation, we are going to be fine with it. So I think one is about compensation for land, so the monetary compensation, and the other part is any program on livelihood restoration. I think there is much more flexibility from the client side, from the private sector, to be able to have a program and help communities improve their livelihoods. So I think it's that distinction.
Thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, this is the only allotted time that we have. I just wanted to take the time and thank all our presenters and our participants. I just shared a link to our evaluation. Just take a few minutes to complete that. We'll follow up in a week or so time with the recorded webinar and all the presented materials, and we'll have it posted in our IFC Sustainability website.